David Brooks says, in a recent Monmouth University survey, 77% of Trump backers said Joe Biden won the presidential election because of fraud. Many of these same people think that climate change is not real. Many of these same people believe that they don't need to listen to scientific experts on how to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. And then he goes on to describe how one of the two political parties in the United States has lost its freaking mind.
So you told me that this morning, right? You came downstairs and said, David Brooks got this new op-ed in which he claims that one of the political parties has lost its mind. And I said to you, which one does he think it is?
Which one, right? Anyone's guess, especially given that it's David Brooks, who, has never been an arch conservative, but certainly leans right under normal circumstances, or at least under historical circumstances. And here he is in the New York Times, which I don't even want to say it leans left, but it certainly leans blue. And here he is suggesting that the red team has lost its mind and that the blue team is left scratching its head over how people could be so darn crazy.
Pure as the driven snow as well.
Right. So anyway, he goes through an argument about the way that the internet is not playing the role that people think it is playing in the fact of the red team having lost its mind and all of that. And he points to, of course, he points to so-called conspiracy theorists, and he points to theories like, I don't even want to call it that, but arguments like QAnon and the culture that has grown up around it. But the problem here, of course, is that it isn't one side. He's not wrong about the fact of there having been a break with reality in certain quadrants on the right. What he's wrong about is that this is in any way unique to the right. And there are certainly things on the left or the blue team that function in exactly the same way. And it's not even hard for us to go through a list. In fact, if we spent a lot of time at it, we could probably, come up with a half an hour's worth of topics to discuss. But the fact that many people on the blue team think that sex is not a binary, that that's a biologically established fact, that to the extent that there are categories of sex that are even worth our time, that people can transition between them at will, that they, in fact, can detect internally that they are of one and not the other, and that their transition is something that manifests a reality underneath.
At the age of 3, 5, 7.
3, 5, 7. People who I feel must never have been 3, 5, or 7, or they would understand just how confused a state of mind those ages might lead you to have. But people on the blue team also believe, widely believe, that that there is no biological content to the concept of race, that this is entirely a fabrication. Now, I'm not arguing, of course, I am not arguing that there are not people whose internal state does not match their sex, and that transition has an ancient root and that it is finding a new footing in modern times. I'm not arguing that there's no truth to that. I certainly have argued many times that the concept of race is not legitimate, but it stands in for one that is legitimate, population.
It's an imperfect proxy for population, and it is both woefully imprecise, and because of its degree of imprecision and the way it is used, it is actually also inaccurate as a proxy.
Well, in fact, I'll go you one better, and this will, for those of you who are paying close attention to the Dark Horse podcast, you will remember our discussion of systematic versus random error. Now, the fact is, race is a bad proxy for population because of racist tendencies, which mean that the error, it's not just imprecision in the concept of race, it is actually systematic bias that is self-serving for the people in a position to define it. So race is a thoroughly compromised term, but that is not the same thing as saying that it is biologically total fiction. It's a bastardization of something. So, okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is actually a point that I made a form of back in, it would have been 2017 in the Wall Street Journal op-ed that I wrote, in which I observed that it seemed to be the Republicans, bizarrely, who were now standing up for science. And as Brooks argues in that very first paragraph of his op-ed today that you read from, the fact of climate change deniers being much more common on the right than the left has allowed this sort of persistent fiction that there are people who believe in science and there are people who don't believe in science, and those map cleanly along blue-red lines. And in fact, belief in science isn't a thing that you should have no matter what. You should have an interest in pursuing the truth and understand that the way to get there is by careful and replicated use of the scientific method, and under no circumstances should you trust a result simply because it fits with your previous model.
Right. And in fact, this leads us to another place in which we have a mixed result on the blue side, where I think the blue side has been better in the early days of coronavirus at figuring out what it was about. But it is amazing how many people on the blue side still believe that coronavirus emerged from nature via a wet market. Right? So the point is, this is just a mythology now. Everybody acknowledges that it didn't come through the wet market, and there is certainly reason to be skeptical that it came directly from nature. In fact, I would argue that that is the much less parsimonious explanation at this moment, because the beginning of the pandemic did not start the way a zoonotic virus would be expected to take off in the human population.
Zoonotic meaning coming from a non-human species.
Right, which is not to say that the virus isn't built of natural stuff, but the question is, did it go through a laboratory phase? And so we can't say that it did, but what we can say is that it is unscientific to rule out that hypothesis, and that for many people who have looked deeply into the question, it is actually more parsimonious that it would have come from a lab leak than directly from nature.
Well, some of what's going on, I think, is that the vast majority of people, and really I think all of us sometimes, feel extreme anxiety and nervousness if the ground on which we are walking metaphorically feels unstable. If we can't figure out what's real, what has been real, what's going to be real. And what this can result in is a desire to get answers quickly and then to stick with them even if they prove to be not right. And so, a little bit like the early days after 9/11. The early days of the pandemic were really, really hard on everyone, but it didn't feel nearly so divisive as it did, in January 2020 and before, or by, June 2020 and afterwards, right? For a couple of months there was chaos and there was dissent and all, but no one really had a sense of what all might be true and who could be trusted. And some of that sense of unease was propagated by our president, but some of it was, I think, organic, because we just didn't know and still don't know a number of things, and because no one yet had picked a side. We were all kind of in it together trying to figure it out, and we spent a lot of time early on in these podcasts talking about that, going into the preprint servers and talking about this is so democratic. Like this is what the results of science should be. Should allow people who are interested in and who can make sense of this research that is being done to go in and say, yeah, actually that headline based on this isn't what the research says, or actually this is a hidden gem and we should be focusing on this. And as soon as people pick teams, then they become trenched in their teams. Then you get tribal affiliation and a real reluctance to change and to take in new evidence, even if that evidence is something that prior to picking your team, even if it was 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months ago, you would have been totally open to it.
Yeah, and so I think the thing is, teams are natural and normal. They can be healthy. They can be malignant.
Yeah.
What can never be healthy is the belief that there is nothing that exists outside of the team dynamic. In other words, the idea that we're going to differ over everything and we're going to pick this set of beliefs and you're going to pick that set of beliefs. There ought to be an awful lot of stuff that we just agree on, right? Like, it would be really great if we could drive coronavirus to extinction so that we could go back to doing what we do well and figure out what went wrong and prevent it from ever happening again. That should all be nonpartisan. And yet this has become this dynamic where you believe one set of things or another, and it is very likely to align with a bunch of other beliefs which have nothing to do with it. And so, to continue down the road, we've got many on the blue side who believe that the 2016 election was hacked by the Russians, right? A story that absolutely collapsed. We have belief on the blue side that either there is no deep state, or that the deep state is people who keep the lights on and not something worthy of consideration, right? When there's a huge amount of evidence that there is some sort of deep thing which is involved in a continuity exercise that makes it unaccountable, and we don't know what it's up to.
And
So
certainly in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, it would have been exactly the Democrats who were most likely to acknowledge that such a thing existed.
absolutely. So anyway, the amazing thing about Brooks' piece is not that it doesn't contain a piece of the truth. It's that it contains what, you close one eye and you see the Brooks version of the truth, and you don't understand that if you look through the other one. I mean, it's a terrible analogy, but in any case, the point is there is a flip side. And once you spot that both sides are losing their mind, and that we are hostage to some dynamic which is causing us not to recognize the huge number of things, in fact, the vast majority of things over which we ought to have very little argument, then, it is time to step back and reevaluate, because, you could write that same article from the red perspective, and, it matches, in fact, something I've been saying for, I think, at least 15 years, which is, the Fox News viewer regards the NPR listener as crazy. The NPR listener regards the Fox News viewer as a fool. And, at some level, they're both right, that these perspectives are, they are unnatural. They are scripted for political purposes. And, the quicker we get a majority of people that stand outside of these things and see the defects in both perspectives, the sooner we can get back to a sane world.